Hi, Dan.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Nice to meet you
Nice to meet.
again.
Nice to virtually meet you. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Dan Ogilvie, a professor emeritus in the psychology department at Rutgers, and you at Rutgers you initiated a course called Soul Beliefs that was very popular. So popular that you had to cap enrollment somewhere around 500 or so because they couldn't fit any more students into the auditorium. The course then became an online course, a MOOC on the Coursera platform, and it's gotten a lot of attention there. So that's what we're going to talk about today is soul beliefs, belief in the soul, belief in the afterlife, things like that, how these beliefs arose, what we should make of them, and so on. And I also want to talk about the course itself near the end of our conversation because there's some interesting ways you approached it with your Rutgers students. You had a situation where, a lot of them came to the course with pre-existing religious beliefs, and there was the potential for some of them, I guess, to get offended. And you handled all of that in an interesting way, and also you monitored their beliefs going into the course, and then again after the course, and had some interesting findings there. So. But why don't we start with just the question of why you thought it was worthwhile to look into this question of belief in souls and teach a course on it?
Well, Bob, this is not it was not the following a scholarly tradition. I had a reasonably okay career in psychology. I taught mostly at Rutgers, but I'd spent a good deal of time at Harvard before that as an undergraduate and a graduate student, and but it was not. And what I did with my career was okay. It was I was a good teacher. I did some reasonable research, and was looking basically towards retirement around year 2000. That would have been a little bit earlier, but it was on my mind, and. All of a sudden, I had a neighbor who ran for the school board, a position on the school board. That was surprising to me, but also interesting. I had no idea that he was interested in the public school system. But then I became aware of his agenda. His agenda was to substitute the Holy Bible for whatever was being taught, texts in history in the public school system, because he wanted to substitute reading history as it actually happened instead of whatever people say now, instead of back in history. So I found that a little bit shocking, and I felt that he could never get away with it, even as a member of the school board. There would certainly be opposition. But the other one that piqued my attention was he wanted to make sure that the theory of evolution was excluded from the science, even the science curriculum in the public school system, grammar school, middle school, high school. And as a scientist, I felt that was just wrong. And so I started attending the Meet the Candidates sessions, and that's when I became actually aware of his agenda. And I was very troubled by it, and I was also troubled by the fact that other members of the audience, there were only 30 or 40 people there, just sort of, oh, that's nice, that's interesting, he's a nice young man. And so I had some questions to ask him about that, including, do you know the difference between science and mythology? And he said, of course he did. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy. And I said, you know that theory of evolution is a vital part of various disciplines, particularly including biology. And to deprive students from a thoroughgoing knowledge of the theory of evolution, of natural selection, would not be fair to their educational future. And the audience members were sort of staring at me. What was wrong with this guy? And finally, I was muzzled by the moderator, saying, your time is up. Okay, so he lost by one vote. in the election. And I was relieved. And then he ran again. And so I had no choice, I felt, to run against him. So with the agenda that we both get defeated. And that worked. In the following year, he ran again. But he was one of 3 candidates for 3 openings on the school board. And I thought, well, I got to run against him. And I beat him by a couple of votes. And my reward was I got to serve on the school board for 6 years.
Congratulations on that.
Yeah, thank you. Actually,
and can I just interrupt you and get clear on something? So you're saying that your motivation for looking into the question of soul belief in the first place was concern about the intrusion of faith-based religious claims in the educational curriculum?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
And I think I've heard you say somewhere that you think that in a way, belief in souls is in a way more central to religion. Maybe I've got this wrong, but is in a way more central to religion than belief in God or something? Or you think its importance is kind of underrated in some sense? Am I right about that?
Yes.
And what do you mean by that?
It's well. First of all, let me back up just a little bit. I went back to my course. So I used to teach large courses, like 300-400 students, and my sense was that the soul, beliefs about the soul, is the foundation of many modern religions and many more ancient religions, particularly because it's the thing that's going to survive. And I hope we get into the whole business of the denial of death and religion to being a solution to that. But backing up a bit, I then asked students in my courses for extra credit, and they love extra credit opportunities to answer the question: do they believe they have a soul? And if so, do they believe the soul is going to survive the death of their bodies? And but I extended that is I asked them to interview various people with the same questions. And if you interviewed yourself and 3 people, then you got full credit. I mean, 3 points or whatever it was. And I was overwhelmed by the majority of people, students, and the people that interviewed, which by and large were their parents and their grandparents and their siblings and their roommates, that almost everybody believed they had a soul. Mm-hmm. And almost all of them also believed it was going to survive the death of their bodies. Now, I kind of knew that because of my own religious background.
Which is that you had been brought up religiously, but were no longer a believer by that time, right?
No. In fact, I was not much of a believer as a kid.
Okay.
And that's how I learned to give this sort of bland expression, because even growing up, I didn't want people to ask me what I was thinking. And what I was thinking mostly is, I can't believe this. And whenever it would leak out that I had suspicions, I would be admonished by various relatives with saying, you've got to have faith. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't quite sure what that meant. But clearly I lacked faith. So then I looked a little bit further into the surveys. There was one in particular in 2007. It's a worldwide survey of people's beliefs about the soul. I couldn't get a copy. It was too expensive to me, so I don't know how they got the sample. But in the United States, 96% of people claimed that they believed they had a soul. And that was astonishing to me. And so I had students, undergraduates, who wanted to do something under my supervision. So one student analyzed some data that what is the soul? What do you believe the soul is? What comprises the soul? And that was pretty interesting. It was I got answers like it's It's my essence. It's who I am. It's my identity, etc. Standard stuff. Then ask other questions that are even more informative. Of what could you not do that you can do now if you didn't have a soul? That gets close to what people's ideas are. Generally, these questions aren't asked. You just believe you have a soul. But you probe into it. Well, I couldn't think. I couldn't feel. I couldn't love. I would be like a zombie without an engine, and I would have no afterlife. And so that was part of the way. So this is a pretty interesting phenomenon, and I don't know that there are any courses about that. I don't know that if it's even possible to generate a course where people could discuss, actually open up the whole topic of soul beliefs, soul and afterlife beliefs, and that seemed to me to be a real interesting, perhaps risky route to take. But as I talked about it in my personality psychology course and in my general psychology course about this topic, students were really interested. They were sitting up. They were fascinated about this topic, and that was very encouraging.
So I'm still not totally clear on what you mean when you say that belief in soul is more fundamental to religion than belief in God, if that's the way you would put it. But the sense in which you think this gets maybe more closer to the heart of religion or something than belief in God.
Well, I mean, obviously belief in God, different beliefs in God are extremely important. But I found, after teaching this course, my colleague and I, Len Hamilton, who is a neuroscientist, he prefers to call himself a brain scientist, because that's the kind of guy he is, we rarely talked about God. I really did focus on soul beliefs. And of course, different soul beliefs and what you need to do in order to make sure or guarantee your soul lands in a good place was more of the focus of the course than specific beliefs about God.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, because it was a course about souls and not a course about God, right?
Right.
So, yeah, okay. So, well, let me ask you this.
That's not a good answer to your question. That was the focus.
I guess a kind of related question is, there are two separable questions, and your survey separated them. One is belief in a soul, and then the other is belief in an afterlife. One could, in principle, believe that there is a soul, but that it dies upon physical death. I gather you're more interested in in a certain sense, you're more interested in the afterlife question, or at least you think that part of the question gets much more at what kind of religion is about.
Well, the only way I can answer that is that the vast majority, I'm talking like 90-95% of people who believe they have a soul also believe it has an afterlife. Mm-hmm. And as religions evolved, I think that that is a key hook for belief in God, belief in various religious traditions. I may be wrong, mm-hmm. but it's really talked about. Certainly it's talked about in religious services and in kind of the what I would consider to be early religious indoctrination. That's an attention grabber, and throughout history, as you've made very clear in your book, Evolution of God. You and Wade, for example, another author who I benefited from reading, it's the Belief Instinct, have led me to move in the direction of staying with religion, but thinking about how did it evolve in such a way that we become, first of all, conscious, and then conscious that we exist, and then are able to project ourselves into the future. It's called planning. At a certain age, kids are able to, around age 4 or so, are able to look forward to what's coming up tomorrow or the next day or the next week. Look forward to going to entering school, looking forward to birthday parties, and becoming a famous athlete or whatever. I mean, it's dreaming.
Right. So this is something the human brain can do,
Right.
independent of religion. It's just a feature of the human brain.
I think it's a very important thing.
Right.
I think it's one of the things that defines us as human beings. Is able to think ahead, imagine the future, and make plans for that, and actually decide whether or not, without even moving a muscle, that possibility is really attractive, or another possibility, no, I don't want that. We make those decisions in our minds, in our heads, and imagining ourselves in the future is very critical for that process. So, I mean, that had nothing to do with necessarily. I mean, it eventually evolved into being able to imagine not existing.
Right. Knowing about death. We're the animals that know will die.
Right.
And now, do you, of course, in tracing the origins of the belief in the soul, of course, one handicap we have in examining prehistoric beliefs is that by definition there's no written record of them because they're prehistoric. Now, the thing that's a common workaround here is to look at hunter-gatherer societies or non-literate agrarian societies that have, that we have records of, maybe often from the 19th or 18th century, because maybe Westerners happened upon them, and as time went on, increasingly even trained anthropologists happened upon them. And of course, the downside of that, obviously, is you don't know how representative they are of the kinds of hunter-gatherer societies that existed 20,000 years ago, and so on. And for all you know, they've been contacted by some technologically more developed society before that, and so on. So, but with all of that as a caveat, what kinds of things do you see on the anthropological record of hunter-gatherer societies? What did you find about soul belief? And I know different societies are different. It's different, and it's hard to generalize. But what kinds of things did you find?
Well, I didn't do any field work personally.
Right. I mean, in the literature.
I did a fair amount of reading of anthropological accounts, and the basic take-home message for me was essentially these societies, and I'm not sure I could completely believe this, were egalitarian. And that there was one tribe, for example, the Piranhas, I think, and that's the typical of other accounts, and that is, you got food, eat it. There's not much looking, planning for the future. Although, I mean, it's clear that they could do that, but it was survival here and now that was the focus of their concern. They lived in a spiritual world. I mean, there was a good deal of ancestor worship, but the job of the ancestors were to help them guide, get guidance, to consult, to be consultants. But if
I can interrupt you, even that idea does presuppose an afterlife, right? The idea was that the spirits of the ancestors are out there to help you.
That's right.
Okay.
And they were living. They were part of the living community.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of a, I wonder from time to time, do the villagers look forward to the time that they can be spiritual consultants? I don't know that, but there's very little evidence of elaborated afterlife beliefs and the requirements that you have to do this and this and this to please God, to get God on your side. I don't see very much of that. I think that's more of a modern, and modern, I mean like 2, 3, 4,000 years old.
Yeah, I think in general in hunter-gatherer societies, and you mentioned Nicholas Wade's book, this is one reason I'm a little skeptical of his thesis that the original function of religion was to be a socially binding thing, and that for that reason we have some kind of belief instinct built into us. I think, the evidence from hunter-gatherer societies is that there, in general, in their religions, there isn't a lot of emphasis in encouraging public-minded behavior, what we might call morally good behavior. Like don't steal, don't kill your neighbor, and so on. It seems that the belief systems are not kind of designed to particularly exert guidance in that realm generally. I mean, leave aside the question of an afterlife and whether you'll get a better afterlife if you're nice to your neighbors. Even just the question of why did a God send this earthquake, or why did a God send this flood? The answers are often not we were bad in some moral sense. It's just we did this thing that offended this God. We didn't treat this God with appropriate respect. So I certainly agree with you that there's not much evidence that the kind of modern notion of a good afterlife being a reward for morally good behavior. I think there's not much reason to believe that was part of the picture very early on in the history of religion. So I think we're on the same page there, as I understand.
Well, I'm encouraged to hear you say that, because you're the scholar.
I didn't go that far, but anyway.
Well, but I agree with you completely.
Yeah. Okay. So then you, in your view, at some point it becomes more common to assert that actually there is that a good afterlife is a reward for good behavior. And do you have ideas about kind of when that enters the picture, or under what circumstances?
Well, from what I've read, it could be you, could be Wade, probably Wade in this regard. The primitive societies, hunters and gatherers, they would have these rituals. Usually drugs were involved in it, and dances that last for hours or days. And it felt that they went into a delusional world and felt that they were in touch with the spirits. And then as hunters and gatherers, I mean, they were actually gangs going around the terrain that hated each other. And
you mean different villages or
different tribes, hunters and gatherers. Once they were unable to live in the forest, survive in the forest, they were out in the open, and they were very competitive, and they had these rituals that kept the group together. That's a way to argue. But then come agricultural period, then you have different tribes together in one place. And instead of each individual being in touch with their own spirits or whatever the belief system was within that culture, in order to get them to cooperate with each other, then again, this is theory, priesthood emerged, and village chieftains emerged, and they were the ones now in touch with the gods. Mm-hmm. They're the ones who became the prophets, and they got hold of this very useful idea that an afterlife would be a good mechanism for social control. That's part of it. That's part of the story, and I'm sure it's much more complicated than that. And so that at that point you get to more in the direction of the monotheism and what God wants you to do. He wants you to be good as a moral person, and it's not only for your own survival now, but in the future, in your afterlife. And that's very, very powerful.
Mm-hmm. Now, in Eastern religions, the form that the idea of an afterlife is more likely to take is reincarnation, right?
Yes.
The idea that you're gonna show up in another organic being, but it will be your soul in some sense. In your view, that's broadly speaking, that's the same idea, right? Because it can be used to incentivize good behavior and so on.
Yeah.
Or do you see a real sharp difference in between
No,
East and
I
West?
understand that, and yes, there is a component there of an afterlife. It's different.
Mm-hmm.
But coming back as a beetle or a fox or whatever.
Or a person in better circumstances often.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so it has that aspect in common. The aspect of this is not it. And you will be rewarded or punished according to how you live this it. Yeah. So that's in common.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, do you in your course you treat this fundamentally as a religious concept, or do you get into the various treatments of the idea by people we would think of as philosophers, not theologians, like Plato does that enter your discussion of the concept?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
It does.
So how do you see them mattering? Because of course, the later parts of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, not to mention the entire, pretty much New Testament, took place in a milieu that was influenced by Greek thought.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, what do you make of somebody like Plato?
Well, in putting together this course, I had a hard time coming up with readings. I mean, it's an academic college course. You need to have some readings, and we found some ones that were certainly acceptable. But I was left in the position of having to write some of the readings, and this was very difficult because I'm not a scholar in this area. But I did piece together an article or a reading assignment of a brief history of soul and afterlife beliefs. And the reason it was difficult for me is that I had no background in philosophy and various other disciplines where one normally should if you're going to offer a course or write something. And so I became familiar with Pythagoras, and I became familiar with Plato and Aristotle and Descartes, and was able to, in some respects, trace the history of the separation of dualism, of the separation of the mind from the body, or the soul from the body, if you wish. And so I became familiar with Plato's notion of the separation of the soul from the body, and the soul is basically a visitor, it can be it's a pure visitor, and it can be damaged by sort of earthly activities, and then on to Aristotle, who gave a more contemporary, as far as I can, notion of what the soul is. It's the essence of a rose is a rose because it has the soul of a rose, and that was fascinating to me. But the one who I got most interested in was Pythagoras, who separated he may have been, I mean, obviously earlier than Plato, the mathematician, and he made a separation between material things and immaterial things. And the material things follow laws, and the immaterial things must, like souls, must also follow the laws, but we don't know. For example, souls can occupy the same space at 2 times. I mean, if you try to imagine yourself being someone else, you can do that. And so they have 2 souls occupying the same. Okay, so all that was really was really fascinating to me. So it did give me a sense of history. I keep on thinking, well, I should get back to revise that paper, but I'm more likely to revise another paper called "The Anatomy of Internalized Beliefs." That became an important aspect. By the way, teaching this course brought me back to life. I had never been so interested in a topic, and I learned so much by teaching this course. Students
so it didn't quite give you an afterlife, but you said it brought you back to life. It didn't quite give you an afterlife in the sense that that many of your students believe a soul does. But anyway, metaphorically.
I hope students don't watch this because, in fact, it was a very selfish thing for me to do in the sense that it was an opportunity for me to learn a lot of stuff, really interesting stuff, and then the side benefit is I conveyed whatever I was able to convey to them, but it was very selfish.
Well, I think that's a common motivation for teaching a course, actually, more common than maybe students realize. But in your case, it's interesting because you didn't just learn what you learned in preparation for teaching the course. You learned something about students and their beliefs in the course of teaching it, and let's talk about that a little. So first, there's this interesting. First of all, let's review. If I understand correctly what you said at the beginning of our conversation, part of your motivation in teaching the course was to get these students to critically examine religious beliefs, right?
At least become conscious of them.
Yeah, and so that could be seen as threatening by religiously minded students. And at the beginning of the course, you did something interesting, I gather, which is, well, why don't you tell us about it? You had students come up and talk about.
It was, I thought then, and I think now, the most interesting and useful thing we did in this course. First of all, it took a while for the Rutgers administration to accept this course as part of a signature course. Signature courses are courses that deal with enduring issues like warming of the planet, wars, this sort of thing. So I came up and we offered this as a possibility, and it took forever, a long time, for them to agree, because they fortunately I brought Lem Hamilton on board. He became more even more enthusiastic about the course as I was, and so I think that the administration thought, well, this is too much of a risk. But at any rate, to reduce the risk, maybe, or whatever, I decided that at the beginning of the course I would invite students to come on stage, and so there'd be 500 students there, and I'd say, are there any Catholics out there? Well, this is New Jersey. Of course, there's lots of Catholics out there. And I said, I asked for volunteers to come up on stage, and usually you get, 8, 10, 12 volunteers. And I said, I want you to answer this question, and that is, what were you told to believe about the soul when you were growing up? The soul in the afterlife when you were growing up. And that was safe. It was safe because it created space for people to talk about what they were told to believe. If I said, what do you believe? I think it would have been vastly different. The students would chat, and the Catholics, they had pretty much of a common story. Although one occasion, a Catholic who hadn't volunteered ran up on stage and said, well, that's not what my nun told me. But then, thank you, Catholics. Are there any Protestants out there? So they came up and they identified what branch of Protestantism that they, and they a little bit more varied, but not much, talked about what they were told to believe about the soul and afterlife. Thank you, Jews. Any Jews out there? And of course, there were a lot of Jewish students in the audience, and they talked about what they were told to believe. And Muslims. This is one thing great about Rutgers is you got such a diversity. And so as it was progressing, both I and the students began to have a sense that, oh man, we were all told the same thing with lots of variation.
Mm-hmm.
That opened up so that it continued on in the recitation sections. Fortunately, in this limited time period,
recitations being the smaller discussion groups that meet separately from the lectures.
That's right, and fortunately, this was one of the rare instances at Rutgers where they coughed up the money to have recitation instructors. So one of the most valuable parts of the course is when students were divided up into groups of 25, mm-hmm. and that's like 12, 14 teaching assistants, and to discuss various topics. Mm-hmm. And those recitation sections, for me, pretty much made the course. I mean, the lecture's fine, that's the thing. But in the recitation sections, we didn't have arguments. You're wrong. There are lots of opinions, but basically we emphasized the readings, discussion of readings, and this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So the purpose of the course was to resurrect beliefs, bring them, air them out, become conscious of them that had been stored away and frequently since childhood, and surround this discussion with readings and lectures so that students could view their internalized beliefs mm-hmm. in the context of a much broader area of philosophy and history and psychology and human development.
Yeah, it sounds like I'm guessing that one of the reasons that was a smart strategy, having them come up front, was that it probably gave all of them the sense that their beliefs were widely shared, or at least the instructions they had been given as to these beliefs were fairly widely shared. In other words, if there hadn't been that kind of display, any given student might have taken some of what you were teaching as a threat to them personally, like an attack on them individually or on their beliefs individually, whereas it seems that you established the fact that belief in a soul is a fairly widespread thing. There's nothing... So it just seems to me it would be harder for them to take it as a personal kind of attack. I would just think it made them feel more intellectually secure. Do you think that's part of what was going on?
Well, that was what happened, and that was our intentions. But you see, my intention was to never make people wrong. Mm-hmm. There's plenty of material out there that does make people wrong. For example, they read a bit, or I lectured a bit about Harris's The End of Faith, Dawkins' the God Delusion, Hitchens, Dennett, other writers that were very popular earlier on in the 6 or 7 years prior to that. And they basically said, you're wrong, you're uneducated, didn't really say that, implied you're sort of stupid. Never did that, because that drives people back into their belief systems and doesn't allow them to explore these belief systems. So if you just talk about what you were told to believe, that's out in the open now, it's in your consciousness, and the context then created by the course, at least this is my hope and I think actually happened, it challenges their beliefs, but they challenge it. They challenge it from internally and maybe in discussions in ways that had never been challenged before, because you never really looked into delved into the topic. Most students had.
But surely your students got the sense by the end that you did not share the kinds of beliefs that many of them had been brought up with, I take it.
Bob, the most thrilling part of the course for me was at the end of each time we only gave the course 3 times. Students came up to me and said, "Excuse me, Would you tell me what you believe?
Okay, so you worked hard not to be explicit about your beliefs.
That's right. That's right.
Now, you did survey the students before and after the course, and about their beliefs. What kinds of things did and didn't change about their beliefs?
The onset of the course, there was a survey and a questionnaire. Also gave it. I had a colleague who gave it to her general psychology course, just for comparison, to see if there was a selected group. And basically, like the consensus that has been mentioned before, a vast majority, 89, 92% of the students in both settings, both intro and this course, believed that in its soul, and that 80% of those believed it was going to go someplace. It had a future. Okay, we did this. I wish it had been a little bit more careful, but it was all right. At the end of the course, with both the general psychology students and the comparison was most people, more people in the general psychology course continue to believe that they had a soul, and it dipped a little bit. For people who had at least the strength of the belief dipped a little bit in for the people who had taken the course.
Who had taken
the soul course?
Okay.
It dipped a little bit. I mean, basically, you say
so there was there was a slight reduction in actual belief in soul in your course.
The strength of the belief.
Yeah, in the strength of the belief. Okay.
Right. And in terms of believing that it had the soul was going to be a player in afterlife, there was a slight dip in that, especially in the course where the strength of that belief had been weakened. But the critical thing for me was, in both instances, do you think that is there scientific evidence for your belief? At time one, yes, definite, very strong. At the end of the course, huge dip in the belief there was scientific evidence for their beliefs in the soul and afterlife. Now, go ahead.
So many of them continued to believe, but now recognize that the belief was based on faith and not evidence.
That's right. That's right. And you said, well, those are kind of disappointing results. You didn't demolish people's beliefs in the soul or in afterlife. Yeah, which was a waste of time. But to sit throughout the rest of their life with the knowledge that there is no scientific evidence, or their belief is that there's very little scientific evidence to support their beliefs. I think it makes a huge difference in the sense that you have to continue to think about it, deal with these issues, and wonder about, maybe update, maybe be less rigorous in promoting their beliefs and wishing other people would do the same, and probably less motivation to take up arms to defend their beliefs for which there is no scientific evidence. That, for me, that was worth teaching the course.
Okay. Now, then it became an online course, and I know that in your case, what happened is that you didn't reteach the course for the cameras that turned it into an online course. I gather Rutgers just wanted to make it an online course, and so they sent videographers into your class. You taught the course as you normally would, and they videotaped it, right? And then that became the Coursera course?
One addition to that is the videotaping was originally because both Len Hamilton and I were about to retire. Mm-hmm. Rutgers knew that this was a course that students liked, and so the design was, the idea was to design a course that could stay at Rutgers and become an online course for credit for Rutgers students. Okay, so that was the context in which we understood why we're being videotaped. Then afterwards, Rutgers, a dean, decided that, hey, maybe we could join the big boys and girls and create an online course through Coursera, and that we did. There was a problem with that because the Coursera likes to chunk courses into 12, 15, 18 minutes. Mm-hmm. This was a little bit more difficult to chunk. Mm-hmm. And so I was basically gave the course away to Coursera, but I was left with the responsibility of editing some of the tapes. And that, Bob, that was the most difficult job of my life, to edit the tapes, because sometimes they'd be looking at my lectures and say, "What is your point? What are you trying to say? How come you're not coming to the end of a sentence?"
Yeah, I can't bear to watch my stuff in that sense.
Oh, it really is a tough exercise. But then, since the cameras were roaming the classroom, the other part of editing was I would ask, how come I'm talking and you have a picture of somebody picking their nose? And I thought, that's not appropriate for this. So it took some work to get out there. It is out there now. Mm-hmm. I've fussed around with some of the reading assignments for the course, for both courses. But what is satisfying about it is that, according to my count, there's over 200,000 people who have viewed this course.
Wow.
And I get correspondences from people around the world, not many, who have suggestions or complain about that mummy is not an Egyptian mummy, that's a Peruvian mummy, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But mostly, my impression is the course has gotten some people to think. And as an educator, what more can you want?
That's your line of work. Yeah. Let me ask you one more question about souls per se. So it sounds like you have an idea about how it came to be believed that good behavior, as society defines good behavior, might get you a good afterlife. That part of soul belief, I think you see as being kind of a mechanism of social control, but in any event, not being part of the original kind of primordial belief, you might say, from back in our hunter-gatherer days. On the other hand, it does seem that there was back in those days, there tended to be some kind of belief in something like a soul. And in fact, there are even kind of etymological things. It's very often a word derived from shadow or shade or something that's used to refer to the soul. But in any event, it's a pretty common belief that something like that does exist, and often that it may be separable from the body. So like I know in some cultures they believe that when they fall asleep and dream, their soul is actually going and doing the things they're dreaming. And as you said, there's a common belief in ancestral spirits and so on. And an interesting question to me is, like, leave aside the afterlife part, and certainly leave aside the idea that you get a good afterlife for good behavior, but how did the idea, and this of course is the sheerest speculation, but how did the idea of a soul get off the ground, so to speak? I mean, is it maybe a result of, not bad conjecture? Because, in a sense, I mean, philosophers still don't have a kind of settled solution to the mind-body problem, right? I mean, the question of, like, why does it feel like something to exist? How does subjective experience come into being? And so on. These are still unsolved problems. So is it like, I mean, do you have to kind of give them some credit in a way for coming up with the idea of a soul, because it is it's an attempt to answer a question that arises through introspection, or what is your does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I don't dismiss that there is a foreplan somewhere or there is a how do you put it, an unseen order, as you state.
That's
And
William James's phrase, actually. I was just quoting him, but yeah,
well, he was one of my friends too. William James, I'm
You
familiar.
read your James.
But I think that modern conceptions, if let's say there is an unseen order,
By which you mean a kind of, in some sense, a higher purpose or something,
yes,
okay,
yeah,
okay,
yeah. I mean,
or a larger purpose, let's say, some
right,
yeah,
something we're not in touch with.
right.
But my general sense is religions, as it's been practiced, can get in the way of that,
Mm-hmm.
of getting into that. An important part of my thinking, which probably moves away from answering your question, is that an important function of beliefs about the soul and afterlife it's a convenient way to deny death.
Hmm.
I mean, kids have two basic realizations as they're growing up. I exist. That's very important. I exist. That smudge on the nose is not on the mirror; it's on me. And then there's the realization. Usually happens around 4 or 5, maybe later. Someday will come that I do not exist, and that's a shocker. It violates the life force, the life instincts of young. It's complete violation, and we don't know what to do. So it's very convenient for parents, for example, when a child says, "I don't want to die," it's an opening for parents or church leaders to say, "Don't worry about it. You're going to die, but not really." And there's a place where you will go if you're good to people and bad to the bad people. That is it intrigues me as an example of a good way, of a long-lasting way to deny death.
Yeah. Although I got to say, I don't find that in it per se all that consoling, because the main problem with death, it seems to me, is all the things you leave behind. I mean, it's all the people you'll no longer see, and
but you will see them.
Well, okay, in some of the more fully elaborate, versions.
Backyard picnic.
Right. Okay, well, I feel better now. Thank you.
Okay, so you'll be fine.
Thank you for consoling me. I'm not sure it's what you had in mind. Okay, well, listen, thank you so much, Dan. And, of course, people, the course is out there on the Coursera platform. It's called Soul Beliefs, Causes and Consequences. Coursera is Coursera. The generic URL is Coursera.org. And if they Google your name and Soul Beliefs, they will certainly come to it. And can join the tens, if not hundreds of thousands who have taken the course. So thank you, Dan, and continued success with the course and all your endeavors.
Well, Bob, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, take care.